Snow gathered like quiet ash along the edge of the platform, softening the shape of the waiting benches and swallowing the sound of boots. The evening train had already gone, leaving behind a thin ghost of steam that hung over the tracks. Mai stood alone, her gloved hands clutching the handle of a small wooden chest bound with a red silk ribbon. Beneath the fur-lined hood, her dark hair caught flecks of snow that melted against her cheeks. She had crossed an ocean for this moment, and yet it had already slipped away like breath on cold glass. The wind carried voices that weren't meant for her. A pair of townsfolk lingered near the freight office, their tones half pity, half contempt. "Guess the Barlow groom didn't like what he saw," one murmured. "Heard he did it on a dare. Ordered a china doll just to see if they'd really send 1 inch," the other laughed softly, the sound brittle as ice. Mai looked up, her gaze fixed on the iron rails disappearing into the grey horizon. Somewhere out there was the man whose letter had promised her belonging, a new life, perhaps a name that could be spoken without mockery. But the letter had been a lie, a cruel joke. When the family came to meet her, their eyes narrowed the instant they saw her face. No words of welcome, only the curt command. "This isn't what we asked for," then the slam of a carriage door, leaving her at the station as the snow began to fall. A gust swept through, rattling the telegraph wires, and she shivered. The hem of her dress was damp, its pale fabric darkened by slush. Inside the station office, light glowed faintly through frosted windows, gold and unreachable. She had spent years learning when not to intrude. Yet, when her fingers turned numb, she approached, peering through the glass. Behind the counter, Martha, the station keeper's wife, sorted envelopes beside the stove. The older woman's eyes lifted, widened, and softened. She opened the door, letting out a sigh of warmth mixed with smoke. "Mercy, child. You'll freeze." Her voice carried kindness wrapped in caution. "Come in then, sit a spell." And Mai obeyed, careful not to drip on the rug. The heat made her eyes sting. Martha poured her tea from a chipped kettle and asked the question without asking. "No one come for you?" And Mai shook her head. "They changed their mind," she said quietly. Her accent curved each word, gentle as snowfall. The woman frowned. "Men out here got hearts of stone, but God don't." She reached for a blanket and draped it over Mai's shoulders. For a moment, the world felt smaller, safer. The tick of the wall clock filled the silence. Then the door creaked open again, and cold air swept in, carrying the scent of saddle leather and pine. A tall man stepped inside, brushing snow from his hat. His beard held silver like frost in dark earth. Martha smiled faintly. "Evening, Arthur Thorne." "Train's gone if that's what you're after," he nodded once, slow and deliberate. Wasn't waiting for it. His gaze found Mai, curious but not unkind. She lowered her eyes, but not before noticing the roughness of his hands, the scar along his thumb, marks of a man who built rather than destroyed. "This the bride the Barlow family sent back?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Martha hesitated. "Seems so." Arthur's jaw tightened. Damn shame. The word startled Mai more than the cold. He didn't say them loud, yet they carried weight. She dared to glance at him. He wasn't handsome the way paintings tried to be, but there was a steadiness in his face, a quietness she recognized. The kind of silence that didn't mean cruelty. "They left you no carriage?" he asked. She shook her head. "No place to go?" No, the bluntness between them left no space for pity. He looked toward the storm gathering beyond the door. "Road will be closed by nightfall." Martha frowned. "She could stay here till morning." Arthur's reply was simple. "This place leaks heat. My cabin's got a fire." The offer hung in the air like a question neither dared answer. Mai's pulse quickened. She had learned the cost of trusting strangers. Yet the alternative was the dark and the cold. "I pay," she whispered. "No need," he said. "I'm not the kind who leaves folks to freeze." His tone made it sound less like charity and more like plain arithmetic. She studied him, then nodded once. Martha packed her a parcel of bread and ham. "You mind yourself, dear," she said softly. "Not everyone out there's cruel. Some just forgot how to speak kindly." Outside, the snow had thickened to a slow-falling curtain. The town was fading beneath it, lanterns glowing behind frosted glass. Arthur led his horse forward and turned back toward her. "You ride." She shook her head. Without another word, he reached down, steady and patient, and lifted her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. The motion startled her, his strength, the closeness, but he kept distance even in proximity, his hands guiding the reins rather than her waist. The horse snorted and began its slow march into the white. They rode in silence. The world shrank to breath and wind and the rhythmic sound of hooves. Trees rose on either side, black against the snow, and she felt the warmth of the blanket he pulled around her shoulders. Once she looked up and saw his profile against the sky, unreadable, carved by years of quiet endurance. When the distant howl of wolves reached them, he murmured, "They don't come near light." "We'll be there soon." She closed her eyes, trusting that promise more than she wished to admit. By the time they reached his cabin, night had fallen fully. Smoke rose from a chimney, pale against the black. He dismounted first, then offered his arm. She hesitated again before placing her hand in his. His palm was warm, calloused, steady. Inside, the fire crackled, throwing amber light over the wooden walls. The scent of pine and coffee filled the room. He poured water into a kettle, moving with deliberate slowness, as if mindful not to startle her. She sat near the hearth, thawing fingers that trembled less from cold now than from uncertainty. "You can sleep by the fire," he said. "Blankets clean." "I'll take the chair." She looked up. "Why help me?" He shrugged. "Someone should have." Outside, the storm deepened, rattling shutters like distant applause. Unmai unwrapped her red ribbon, smoothing it on her lap. It was the only color left from her old life, a thread between worlds. When she tied it to the handle of her chest, she felt the smallest flicker of warmth return. Across the room, Arthur watched the flames, their light reflected in his eyes. Neither spoke again, but in the hush between crackle and wind, a strange stillness settled. The old station bell tolled once in the distance, muffled by weather, sounding more like memory than metal. Unmai lifted her head toward the sound, wondering if the world had forgotten her name or if it was simply learning to pronounce it differently. Arthur stirred, listening too, and said quietly, almost to himself, "No train waits twice in these parts." Then he looked at her and added, "But maybe it don't have to." The storm lasted all night. By dawn, silence returned, thick and heavy, as if the snow had swallowed every sound in the world. Unmai woke to the faint crackle of the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled faintly of pine. Across the room, Arthur Thorne sat in a chair by the hearth, chin lowered to his chest. He had fallen asleep sitting up, a rifle resting near his knee. She moved quietly, unwilling to wake him. As she washed her face in a basin of melted snow, her reflection shimmered on the water's surface, half ghost, half stranger. When Arthur stirred, she straightened quickly. He rubbed his eyes and regarded her for a few seconds. "You sleep any?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "A little," she said softly. "Good." Storms eased. Roads are gone, though. Won't be no passing wagons till the thaw. He stood and began pulling on his coat. "I'll feed the stock." When the door shut behind him, she looked around the cabin again. Everything spoke of solitude, the single plate by the sink, the one chair near the table. She found herself wondering if he'd chosen this life, or if the world had chosen it for him. She tied it instinctively, folding the blanket, sweeping stray pine needles from the floor. By the time Arthur returned, dusted in snow, she had warmed the kettle and set 2 tin cups beside the fire. He paused at the doorway, taking in the small domestic order she had created. His brow furrowed, as though he wasn't sure whether to be grateful or uneasy. "You don't have to work," he said. "It helps," she replied simply. He poured coffee dark as soil. They sat opposite one another, the table between them a fragile peace offering. "You got anyone waiting east?" Arthur asked. She shook her head. "No one now then west." Her eyes lowered. "No one wanted me west." He said nothing, but something in his expression softened. He reached for a loaf of bread, broke it in half, and slid her a piece. Their fingers brushed briefly. The touch felt startling. The hours stretched quiet. He fixed a loose hinge on the window, she mended a tear in the curtain. Their movements became a wordless conversation, a rhythm of small survival. By evening, he brought in chopped logs, stacking them by the fire. "You cook?" he asked. She hesitated. A little. He gestured to the stove. "Have at it." Then it was the first smile she'd seen from him, not much of one, but enough to thaw something inside her. She boiled rice from her chest and added bits of jerky, a humble stew with the fragrance of home. When he tasted it, he blinked as if caught off guard. "That's different," he said. "Bad?" He shook his head. "Good. Just new." Later, as night fell, the wind rose again. Arthur sat sharpening a knife, his face silvered by firelight. "The town," I began cautiously. "They will talk, they always do," he said without looking up. "They will say you take me in, I did, they will say I stay." He met her gaze then, eyes steady as winter stone. "Then let them talk." Something in the quiet between them shifted. Not warmth yet, but the hint of trust. Hours later, after he banked the fire, she spread her blanket on the floor again. He pointed to the bed. "Take it." "I cannot, you'll freeze down there." She shook her head. "I am warm enough," he exhaled slowly, accepting she would not be moved. I studied him quietly, realizing that his solitude was not pride, but protection. Outside, the moon broke through the clouds, silvering the snow-covered plains. She whispered something in her mother tongue, half prayer, half promise. Behind her, Arthur's voice came low and steady. "Town's 15 miles. When it clears, I can take you there if you want." She turned slowly. The thought of returning to those sharp, measuring eyes filled her with a cold more biting than any storm. "I don't know where to go," she said. He nodded once. "Then stay till you do." The simplicity of it left her speechless. He meant it as practicality, nothing more. But beneath it, she heard something different, permission to exist without apology. For the first time since leaving China, she felt safe enough to let her guard fall. The fire whispered low, painting both their faces in gold. No longer rescuer and rescued, but something quieter, something waiting to be named. By midwinter, the town had already made a story of them. The first time I heard her name in someone else's mouth, she was buying flour from the general store. The bell above the door had barely finished ringing when the chatter paused. A woman near the stove whispered something sharp behind her palm. "Don't look now," but the China woman's got herself settled right fine with Thorn, and I kept her gaze low. Mr. Finch, the shopkeeper, cleared his throat with awkward gentleness. "Storm keeping you folks busy up there?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, much snow." "Arthur fixed roof." He nodded, polite but cautious. When she turned to leave, the women near the stove didn't bother to lower their voices. "Pretty little thing, ain't she?" Surprised, he took her in. "Thought Thorn didn't care for company. Lonely men change come winter," the other said. Their laughter followed her out into the street, thin as a blade. When she reached the fence line, she saw him there, sleeves rolled, arms taut with labor. He glanced up and nodded toward the bundle in her hands. "Flour." "Yes." She hesitated, then added softly, "People talk." He swung the axe once more, burying it deep into the stump. "They've been talking about me my whole life. Never said anything worth listening to." "You let 'em talk." "Words melt faster than snow." So she filled the cabin with small signs of presence, folded towels, a candle by the window, her tea steaming beside his coffee. He never said thank you, but his eyes softened, and that was enough. One morning, she planted sprigs of green onion in a wooden box by the window. "They will grow," she told him. Arthur raised a brow. "In this cold?" "Maybe not today," she said, "but they try." He looked at her a long moment, then nodded. "Guess that's all any of us can do." The quiet companionship became the rhythm of winter. Then, one afternoon, Sheriff Brody rode up the snowy trail. "Thorn," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. Heard tell you're harboring someone not supposed to be here. Arthur's reply was even. She's got every right to warmth, same as anyone. Maybe so, Brody said, but folk are uneasy. Papers matter in times like these. I know folks can be mean when the world's too quiet, Arthur said. You tell them she's under my roof. That's all they need to know. When Arthur came back inside, he only removed his hat and sat down heavily. Don't worry about him. World's full of men who ain't learned manners. You defend me, she whispered. He shrugged. You're part of this house now. Wouldn't make sense not to. Her chest ached at that, how simply he said what no one had ever dared give her, belonging without demand. That night, as the wind howled, she rose and went to the window. Outside, the onion sprouts had begun to show, tiny green threads pushing through frozen soil. She smiled, whispering, "They try." From the chair, Arthur's sleepy voice murmured, "What's that?" "They try to live," she said. He made a soft sound, half laughter, half wonder. "So do we." The storm came without warning, rolling down from the northern ridge like a wall of night. Unmai lit the lanterns as Arthur secured the barn. He burst in just as the door threatened to tear from its hinges. "Worse than last time," he muttered. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, then harder, more insistent. Arthur reached for the rifle leaning by the door. "Stay back." He lifted the latch. 3 figures stood on the porch, men wrapped in coats, their faces red from wind and whiskey. The Barlow brothers. "Well, look what we found," said the eldest, Lyle Barlow, his voice thick with drink. "Ain't this cozy? You took in our mistake." Arthur didn't move. "Ain't your concern what I do under my own roof?" Lyle grinned, yellow teeth glinting. "She was meant for my brother, not some broke rancher. We come to collect what's ours." Sunmai stepped into view before Arthur could stop her. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "I am no one's to collect," she said. The younger Barlow spat into the snow. "That's not how it works, sweetheart. You were bought and paid for." Arthur's hand tightened on the rifle. "You best ride home before that mouth of yours freezes shut." One of the men stepped forward. The motion was small, but it snapped something taut inside Arthur. He raised the rifle, not to aim, but to warn. "That's far enough." Lyle's grin faltered. "You going to shoot me over a woman?" Arthur's reply came steady as thunder. "If I have to." For a long moment, the wind filled the silence. "Ain't worth dying out here," Lyle muttered, turning to his brothers. "We'll come back when the law's with us." Their curses were carried away by the wind. When their hoofbeats vanished, Arthur shut the door and leaned his forehead against it, breathing hard. Unmai approached, her voice low. "They will return maybe." He set the gun aside. "You will fight again." "If I must." He looked at her then, and something unspoken passed between them. "You fight for me?" He shook his head. "No. I fight for right. You just happen to be part of it." Her lips curved faintly. "Then I am glad to be part." She stood beside him by the window, watching the night devour itself. Near midnight, a sound split through the storm, the crack of a branch, or maybe a gunshot. Arthur opened the shutter an inch. Darkness moved beyond the yard. "Get the lamp," he murmured. When she lifted the light, they saw them, 2 horses, riderless, reins tangled in the fence. The Barlow brothers hadn't made it home. The storm had taken them. "No man wins against the storm," Arthur said finally. Unmai looked out into the white, her voice a whisper. "Or against his own cruelty." He turned to her slowly. "You think God keeps score?" "I think," she said, "the wind remembers." They stayed awake till dawn. The storm eased, leaving the world new and fragile. Unmai opened the door and stepped outside, the air sharp and clean. Arthur joined her, boots crunching through the snow. "World's quiet after a fight," he said. She nodded. "Because it listens." He studied her face, then reached into his pocket. From it, he drew a small silver ring. "This was my mother's. Never thought I'd have reason to use it." Her eyes widened. "Why show me?" "Because the world's watching," he said quietly. "And I want it to see we ain't ashamed." I mean, you stay because you choose to, not because I saved you. I just want you to know that. She looked down at the ring, then back at him. Then I choose, he nodded, tucking the ring back into his coat. We'll talk to the preacher when spring comes. For the first time in months, a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. The storm had taken the world apart, but in its ruin, something had been rebuilt. The thaw came slowly. By late March, the valley stirred back to life. But the peace between them carried a tension as fragile as spring ice. Word traveled that the remaining Balokin planned to take the matter to the sheriff. One night when Arthur came in from the barn, his jaw was tight. They say they'll take it to court, he muttered. Say you were never meant to be here. That you'll be sent back east back, she whispered. He nodded once. I won't let them. You cannot fight everyone. Then I'll fight the whole damn county if I have to. He walked to the table, pulled open a drawer, and took out the small silver ring. It's time, he said simply. The next morning, they rode into town. Anmai wore her white shawl, Arthur wore his cleanest shirt. When they reached town, every window seemed to watch them. People stopped what they were doing. Arthur dismounted and offered his hand to Anmai. She took it without hesitation. Together, they walked toward the church. Reverend Miller was sweeping the steps. His eyes flicked between them, confusion knitting his brow. Mr. Thorne, he greeted slowly. And Miss. Anmai. Arthur removed his hat. Reverend, we'd like the bell to ring for us today. The man hesitated. That's no small request. Folks in town. I know what folks say, Arthur cut in. But I ain't asking for permission. I'm telling you, I mean to make it right, proper. Reverend Miller looked at Anmai, perhaps expecting shame. But her gaze was steady, her chin high. Please, she said softly. Let the bell ring once for truth. The old man's eyes wavered. He nodded toward the door. Come inside. The church smelled of wax and cedar. Arthur and Anmai stood before the small altar as the preacher read from a worn book. The words to have and to hold, to cherish, to keep echoed through the empty pews, steady and sacred. When he asked for vows, Arthur's voice came rough but clear. I take her as mine by choice, not by chance. Anmai's reply trembled with feeling. And I take him as my home. When it was done, the preacher turned toward the rope and pulled. The sound that followed rolled through the valley like the first breath after silence. Deep, solemn, unyielding. Outside, the crowd that had gathered parted slowly, uncertain. Martha, standing near the station, smiled faintly and pressed a hand to her heart. When they reached the edge of town, Anmai looked back at the church tower. It sounds different now, she whispered. How's that? Like it belongs to us, he smiled then, a quiet, weary, radiant smile that reached his eyes. Reckon it does. They rode home through a field washed clean by sun. When they reached the cabin, a red ribbon she'd tied to the porch post fluttered wildly, catching the light like a living flame. As evening fell, they sat together on the porch, the land stretching silent and endless around them. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her without thinking. In the distance, a train whistle echoed, the same sound that had marked her arrival. Only now it didn't sound like leaving. It sounded like beginning. Arthur watched the sunset paint her face and said quietly, You think the world will ever stop talking? She smiled, eyes half closed. Let them. I have learned not all noise is meant to hurt. He nodded, content, and the wind carried the faintest chime from the church far away. The bell still swinging, its song stretching over hills and snow, and all the places where love had once been unwelcome. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would sometimes hear that same sound and swear it rang sweeter there than anywhere else. But those who knew whispered the truth. It wasn't the bell that changed. It was the people who finally learned to listen.